It is my pleasure to welcome you today, and I will now turn it over to Justin Salas, a partner in Lathrop GPM's Franchise Practice Group and an active member of the firm's Culture, Diversity, and Inclusion Leadership Committee. Justin?
Thank you, Vanessa and Stephanie, and hello, everyone. I'm going to begin by extending a third welcome to the first program in this increasing franchising series. We're happy to have you with us here today. And the title of the program today is Where Are We and How Can We Improve? And in terms of what we hope to accomplish today, it's to have a critical table setting discussion that touches on a couple of things. One is a brief history of franchising and its relationship with diverse minority groups, and in particular, African American. Chatelain's work. The second thing that we hope to do is get a sense of where we are today in terms of diversity and franchising in the current landscape. And then finally, we'll touch on opportunity improving diversity in franchising and how we might meet those opportunities. And with respect to the last topic, we'll spend the balance of the series kind of unpacking what really the meat of this issue, and that is how do we meet the challenges of increasing diversity in franchising today. And so, before I go any further, I just want to stop and thank all of you for attending today. The only way that this program is going to be successful is if we have an audience to empower and we are able to provoke thought, conversation, and action. We can't do that without an audience. So thank you for being here. And thank you for investing in an issue that we view as very important. Now, with that said, let's start empowering and provoking. And I can't think of a better way to do that than with our first speaker and featured speaker, really, Chatelain. Dr. Chatelain is a professor of history and American studies at Georgetown University, right here in Washington, D.C. And in fact, I just told Dr. Chatelain that if she were in the office, I could probably open up my window and wave to her. That's how close the campus to where we are, or where I am right now. In addition to being a professor at Georgetown University, Dr. Chatelain is the author of the Pulitzer Prize history-winning book, Franchise: The Golden Arches in Black America, which tells a fascinating story of the emergence of franchising in the United States and its dynamic relationship and of tension and cooperation, really, with the Black community, the civil rights movement, the battle for racial equality, among other things. So we're lucky to have Dr. Chatelain with us today. Her work is timely, it's interesting, and it's incredibly thoughtful. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Chatelain.
Thank you so much, Justin. And thank you, Vanessa, for reaching out and making the initial contact. We were classmates at the University of Missouri, and it was great to hear from her and hear about the work that she's doing around diversity and inclusion in this sector. So today I'm going to talk to you about my book, Franchise: The Golden Arches in Black America, that in many ways is a play on words. It is the story of how McDonald's entered African American communities in the moments after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968. As a historian of African American life and culture, my goal is to always think about how did we get to the places in which we normalize a set of relationships and a set of connections that seem everyday common sense. And for this book, I wanted to think about the ways that McDonald's particularly, but fast food broadly, has become a fixture in so many African American communities. We know that there is a lot of concern about health disparities, about the quality of waged work in America, as well as access to healthy foods. And what often happens in these discussions is that there's a conversation about why certain communities, particularly working class communities of color, poor communities of color, why there is an over-reliance perhaps on fast food. But I wanted to ask a question that took us away from the individual consumer choices of people to think about the historical framing of how does a brand like McDonald's that grows up in the 1940s and flourishes in the mid-century suburbs, which many of were exclusively white, how does this kind of business make this transition into many of the urban cores that we see today? And this is a story about the convergence of, I think, three really important phenomenon in this period of time that I think for the nature of your work as you strategize about what kind of presence your business wants to be in communities, particularly communities that have been historically marginalized. What does this all mean? So the first was the response to Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination. We know that major cities found themselves in the middle of what we would call racial upheaval, confrontations between everyday people and the police. We know that in some places there was significant property damage. And there was an overwhelming sense that the assassination of Dr. King was one of many tragedies surrounding the unfinished business of racial justice. And so, in the ways that the George Floyd summer of 2020 inspired different companies to reflect on their histories as well as their practices around inclusion, McDonald's and then other fast food restaurants followed after, decided to start recruiting African American business people to become franchisees. And in this early period, roughly between 1968 and 1974, McDonald's discovered that African American franchisees were performing incredibly strongly in sectors of the community that had really, really suffered from neglect in terms of city services, funding for well-paid jobs, as well as other support systems. So the success of Black franchisees inspires greater market concentration on the African American community. And what my book charts are these different moments of tension and controversy about what the role of business, what is the role of a Black owned franchise to the larger question of the vision that Dr. King had for America. And with each chapter, I look at these vignettes where community leaders are protesting McDonald's. Some community leaders are embracing McDonald's. And at every turn, there's this question about roles and responsibilities. And I think that these are questions that still emerge today. So the first part is about this kind of entry point into the marketplace. The second is a deliberation on the changes in the civil rights struggle after 1968. So between 1954 and 1965, the civil rights movement in the United States celebrated a series of legislative victories and Supreme Court rulings, including the desegregation of public schools, the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that protects people in public accommodations, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But in the middle of all of these victories, there was a real question as to whether legislation and whether court rulings could really change the quality of people's lives. African American unemployment was still a chronic problem in major cities. The youth unemployment rate was over 50% in places like Chicago and New York. There were questions about whether or not African Americans could actually enjoy these new opportunities in education and business and housing if there wasn't an economic structure for them to participate in. And so as a result, leaders of the civil rights struggle, including leaders of Martin Luther King Jr.'s organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the NAACP, and the Urban League, among many, started to partner with franchisors to promote franchising as an opportunity not only for business acquisition and wealth building, but an opportunity to reinvest in the local level and communities. And in this period of time, we see these different relationships between people who had participated in the civil rights struggle, like the sit-in movements, like the freedom rides, people who ran for office in the 1960s, like the late Julian Bond, promoting franchising as the next step in Black economic progress. And the shift from agitating for legislative change to really turning inward into communities to think business investment might be the next step played an important role in creating and building trust between these major national brands and local people. And the reason why this is very important, not just for the process of business, but because some of these brands had been engaged in the acts of segregation that we associate with businesses like Woolworths or Katz Drugs, where African Americans and white customers were not served on an equal basis. And so businesses like McDonald's, businesses like Hardee's had to deal with the practices of segregation in the South. So in the early 1970s, there was a kind of remaking of these brands to be more culturally relevant and culturally responsive to the African American consumer. This was also a period of time where market research as well as advertising agencies were specializing in the Black market, as it was called. And this targeted approach to developing consumer loyalty and consumer trust goes a long way in fueling the popularity of fast food in African American communities. My research is also a story about, I think, broken promises as well, because one of the things that I posit in the book is that the fundamental problem isn't that hamburgers exist or French fries exist. I think they're quite tasty. It's the fact that when we only look to business, and particularly when we only look to Black-owned businesses to carry the weight of their local communities, we set up business owners and business ownership to fail in many ways because they cannot really deliver fully on the various promises we hope that they can. And so my position is that we have to find a really clear balance between wanting businesses to thrive in communities by hiring local people, by being philanthropic, by being fair and just in its payment of taxes, in its employment of workers, in its assigning of wages, and ensure that we pressure a federal system that has the robust resources to take care of people in their local spaces. In this early story of African American franchises, it isn't just McDonald's. There's many attempts by African Americans to create their own franchise systems and become franchisors. But one of the challenges that they repeatedly come up against is the fact that they do not have the capital, the real estate, and the leverage of McDonald's. That bank lending is still fraught with discrimination, that the opportunities for African Americans to really create their own systems are still tied to the type of discrimination that the civil rights struggle was trying to dismantle. And so in these vignettes of people like the former NFL star, Pittsburgh Steeler, Brady Keys, and his desire to start his own fast food fried chicken outfit, and he can't sustain his business because he can't match the power of the other legacy brands. There are people who try to start these networks of encouraging Black franchise ownership, but they aren't able to sustain their businesses. And so I think that at the end of the day, my contribution as a historian and as a scholar and as a critic of the franchising system is the importance of understanding the history of how minority franchise outfits have worked, how they have enriched some people in the system who have become incredibly philanthropic and have helped sustain Black institutions like historically Black colleges and local school programs, have funded athletics, who have created community resources. But I also want to add that this has to play one part of a larger movement that returns to the origins of the civil rights struggle, that makes sure that there's equal access to opportunity for all people, that it can't just be African American businesses that advocate and deliver it, that it has to be a really broad-based mission. And so I think that we are in a period of time post George Floyd, post Black Lives Matter's resurgence, post companies doing the reflective work to think about their past and imagine the future. Among all of these conversations, I think we have to be uniquely aware that the power of any organization isn't just in the recruitment of diverse franchisors or diverse franchisees, but the power has to be for advocacy to create a robust social safety network so that workers can feel safe with access to childcare, education subsidies, that they have good housing, that they have good healthcare, they have all of these things that make them the best possible worker, and that the possibility of these things aren't necessarily tied to just the bottom line and the profits of the individual company. And this was something that, as a historian of African American businesses, I think is incredibly poignant in the work. The number of African American businesses, funeral homes, banks, and later franchises that are unable to keep up with the incredible demands and needs of their local communities. And so I want to stop my formal comments here, and I look forward to this conversation, and I look forward to sharing more of this history, because at the end of the day, in order for us to really be able to forge creative and innovative and just solutions, we have to look to this history, and we have to look at the complicated ways that people feel like they've been served as well as starved by various policy prescriptions that sometimes fail to take in account the depth of the problems of racial injustice, as well as the needs to make sure that all sectors of our society are working for the common good. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dr. Chatelain. And for those of you that have not had a chance to read Dr. Chatelain's book, I could not recommend it more. It's an incredible work, not only for, as you can see, Dr. Chatelain's exceptional storytelling ability, but also for its incredible thoroughness on the topic that it treats, and its incredible thoughtfulness. So again, if you get a chance, please do to read the book, and don't take my word for it in terms of what an exceptional read it is. You can take the word of the Pulitzer jurors who decided to award it a Pulitzer Prize in history. Now with that, we will invite a couple of additional panelists and have a discussion that'll touch on some of the issues that Dr. Chatelain has raised in her remarks, and also address kind of where we are in terms of diversity and franchising, and how we might improve. So with that, I'd like Michael Lehman of the International Franchise Association to join us, as well as John Lancaster of Choice Hotels. And I will have, I've asked Michael and John to introduce themselves, and then we'll jump into the discussion. And if you have questions, audience, please feel free, as Stephanie said, to put those in the chat box, and then we'll do our best to save a good amount of time at the end of this discussion to address those questions. And we'll also do our best to follow up on any questions that we're not able to get to during our time here today. So Michael and John, if you could introduce yourselves, that'd be great.
Sure. Thanks, Justin. And thank you to Lathrop GPM for the invite and for launching this great series. It's a pleasure to be with Dr. Chatelain and John both today. I'm Mike Lehman, Vice President of Government Relations at IFA. IFA works to promote, enhance, and defend franchising, the local businesses that are driving our economic recovery out of COVID right now. We represent franchisors, franchisees, and suppliers to our community, and promoting diversity in franchising is a major priority of ours. And we think the paths to success within franchising, both for prospective franchisees and for workers, are wider, more accessible, more democratic for people of all backgrounds than in many other business formats. So with that, I look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you, Michael, and I too echo your sentiments on being here with Lathrop GPM and Dr. Chatelain and Justin. Thank you for the opportunity to speak, and is also with you, Michael. My name is John Lancaster. I'm the Vice President of Emerging Markets and Owner Relations at Choice Hotels International. Choice Hotels is a franchisor of over 7,100 hotels throughout the world, with 600,000 guest rooms and in 40 countries. What my title typically incites is a destination, but what my title actually from an emerging market standpoint states is a specific ethnicity: African American, Latin American, Native American, and veterans, which we target, and women, which we target as under opportunized Yes, I know I'm changing the Webster's dictionary word, under opportunized franchisees. So we focus and target on getting them into our system.
Thank you both. And Michael, I'll start with you. That FA in partnership with Oxford Economics recently came out with a report on, essentially the state of franchising. I was hoping that you could give an overview of that report. And then if you could touch on where we stand today in terms of diversity in franchising, in what opportunities you see for improving in that area.
Great. Justin, I'll perhaps answer your questions in reverse order. Let me start by saying that we would say at IFA that the state of diversity in franchising is pretty strong. And look, if that sounds lukewarm, it's a reflection that there is always more that can be done, that we can do as a franchising community to expand opportunities. But it's also the reality of what I mentioned before, that franchising, we believe strongly, provides a wider path to business ownership. It provides a wider path to upward mobility for workers than many other business models. 30% of franchises are owned by people of color, and that's higher than the non-franchise statistic. And both the IFA and the IFA Foundation want to ensure that our organization is doing its part, not just to promote the opportunities, but to reflect the industry that we represent. So franchising is good for communities of color, people of all backgrounds, and it will remain a commitment of IFA to promote these ideals. We have as mentioned, we have a Black Franchise Leadership Council that we started just this year. That council's mission is to amplify the success of the Black community by utilizing the franchise concept through membership and continued education. We also host a Franchising Pride Council, which provides opportunities for mentorship and foster discussions around best practices to benefit others. And we also have a Diversity Institute and have had for many years. And its mission is to help build on the solid foundation and advance diversity of all kinds in franchising. So Justin, you mentioned our research. Last month, we launched a new campaign for franchising that we're calling Open for Opportunity. You can go to openforopportunity.com, and I'll share that link in a little bit. But this campaign is about showing the rest of the country about the contributions of America's 700,000 plus local franchisees, that they are open for opportunity, that they're spearheading the economic recovery, and that they're serving every community. One of the 4 pillars of this campaign is diversity, equity, and inclusion. And just as each business is unique, so is franchising. And so part of this campaign, not only do we think these things about the opportunities with franchising, but Justin, you mentioned the research we released. This is a key component of this new campaign. We asked Oxford Economics to test many of these hypotheses that we think about franchising. That it is more diverse than people realize, that it provides opportunities that are more accessible than other business models, and that our businesses within franchising contribute to their local economies and build wealth in underserved communities, more so than a big corporate chain that plops down in a particular area. And so what this Oxford research showed is a lot of things. One, that franchises are more diverse than other businesses. Again, 30% of franchises are owned by people of color. That's compared to about 18% of non-franchise businesses. And perhaps more importantly, we found that Black-owned franchises earn 2.2 times more than Black-owned independent businesses on average. So once the opportunity is presented, there really is a wider path to wealth creation within the franchise model. I'll put the link in the chat box to this research, but we really think that the research shows that the franchise model is working for our families, our neighbors, and our community.
Thank you, Michael. And John, you've been at this work for some time. That is the work of trying to increase diverse ownership in franchise. I know that Choice has been at the work for some time as well. I'd like, if you could, can you share your thoughts on where we are today in terms of diversity and franchising, and what progress has been made over the last 15 or so years?
Yes, Justin. So I know the article and the research mentioned, it's 30% of minority owners of franchises. But if you break that down even further, I believe it's 11.8, 11.9% for Asian ownership. It is 10.4% of Hispanic ownership, and 8% of all African Americans for African American franchise ownership. Well, at Choice, specifically in hospitality, the franchise ownership makeup is dramatically different from an ownership standpoint. So I will say of 58,314 hotels, that 60% or more are owned by East Indian or Asian culture. And that comes down to the African American ownership of 1%. To Latinx ownership of 0.5%, to a women ownership of 8%, to Native Americans of 0.3%. So where we have from in the past, we have made some hard progress, but as you can hear in those statistics, we still have a lot of work to do. I believe that work is predicated upon businesses making sure they are reaching out to some of the territories and some of the areas, as Dr. Chatelain mentioned in her comments. Typically, there's a lack of information about franchising. So how do we move forward? A lot of the times in school, we ever speak about franchising? Did we speak about franchising in high school? I didn't. I'll ask you if anybody else did. And it's something from an educational standpoint, just to make sure we give an inception of that thought into people's mind prior. What are organizations doing to promote under-opportunized minorities in franchising? Are they putting their dollars where they say they want to help, as Dr. Chatelain mentioned earlier? So where are we going? There's nowhere to move but from. And right now, with some of the events, which is not anywhere near the cataclysmic events of Dr. King, but with George Floyd, we're at an inflection point. So we stand here again the same way after Rodney King, same way after Dr. King, asking ourselves, how can we move forward and what we need to do?
John, it's interesting that you raised those sort of historical points of racial tension. I have to say that the idea for this series arose sort of in the wake of the murder of George Floyd last May, and this resurgence in calls for racial equity and justice. And a group of us got together and thought about how we might use our professional expertise, which happens to be in franchising, in our resources to try to contribute to the struggle for equity. And Dr. Chatelain, one of the things that I found particularly interesting about your book is the frequency with which these calls for economic empowerment and business ownership come up during these inflection points of racial tension. And you argue quite convincingly, and I think this can be taken from your opening remarks as well, that increased business ownership and economic empowerment are not necessarily the solution to the problems of our day. But I'm wondering if so perhaps all we can hope to do here is lower the barriers to access and participate in what Michael has shown is an incredibly important part of our economy for underrepresented minority groups. But I'm wondering if you can share your thoughts on sort of what we might do in connection with this work to optimize the benefit to communities. And if you can share any examples, historical examples, I think that would be particularly helpful.
Well, I think that this is a question about, how we leverage impact and how we leverage influence. And so, my position is, everyone is going to make the best decision they can under constrained circumstances. And for African Americans in 1968, if you are getting an opportunity to franchise a McDonald's, this is unbelievable. This is life-changing because you are entering a kind of possibility for economic prosperity that is unheard of during this time. And at the same time, we see, and we know that there's some, current issues that are being, negotiated with McDonald's and their African-American franchisees. There's also an awareness of the pervasiveness of race in undercutting opportunity, even when a person has a good opportunity, because of the other structural barriers, whether it's the higher cost of doing business in some communities compared to others because of the way insurance rates are negotiated, because of disparate tax liabilities, because of security costs, because of, barriers to workforce development. And so all of this is to say that, if we are talking about opportunity, we have to say, what are the conditions, whether because of race or because of structural inequality, is this person establishing a business? And how do we use our leverage and influence to remedy those issues so that when we talk about recruiting for any kind of institution, we know everyone is starting in the same place. And this is the fundamental dilemma. And this is one of the reasons why, after these big moments of racial crisis, even before King's assassination, whether it's the Watts uprising, whether it's, the hot summers of the 1960s, these city commissions would say, well, what do people want? And people would be very clear. They want freedom from police brutality. They want quality schools for their kids. They want good jobs. They want, fair and equal housing, but they also want to spend money in places where they don't feel exploited or taken advantage of or disrespected. And in many ways, of all these very complex problems, business seems maybe the easiest path to pursue, but we have to then take those business successes and use them to leverage our power to remedy those other issues in ways that really are about true partnership for the community, not just these sporadic opportunities to enter business, because that will not safeguard us from the continued unrest and the continued turmoil that we see, every decade, every 20 years on kind of a loop. And so I think that this is where we really have to start thinking bigger. And this is where, when we talk about leadership development, when you are talking particularly about African Americans, but many communities of color, a person entering business, they are not just entering a space to do transactions. They are now entering a space of political and social influence in their community, and their concerns may be very, very distinct and very attuned to these other structures that I noted.
John, again, Choice has been at this work for some time, and so I'm wondering if you can share some of your thoughts on how the organization has benefited from its push to increase diversity within its system, and to the extent you can, sort of the communal impact on those efforts.
Sure, fantastic. And a lot of the comments that Dr. Chatelain made are something that are very viable and why we have done this. So Choice has been working on our emerging markets program for over 15 years. And we have awarded and financially supported over 270 under-opportunized franchisees to get into the system. During this time, it has benefited us by having a much more diverse franchisee group, and it has inculcated a lot of culture within our organization. Things that we have done to move forward, we actually implemented CHOA. CHOA is an acronym for the Choice Hotel Owners African American Alliance. And this is a group of owners that meet with our CEO once a quarter to talk about opportunities, to talk about challenges, and to talk about wins in the African American community. As Dr. Chatelain mentioned, that many times those franchises are in underserved areas, and those business owners are now, become, the linchpin for that community, and are looked up to and are needed to build that community. For example, we were working with Bob Nesbitt. He actually revitalized an area in Birmingham, Alabama, the old Five Points area that is revitalized next to a crossplex, which is a sports community. And some of the challenges that he had in getting that hotel constructed and finding the correct business partners are some of those challenges that we address head on. So Choice sees not just diversity in franchisees, but diversity in employment. We want to make sure that all of our employees have an opportunity from an educational standpoint to understand where they are. We have a partnership with the Executive Leadership Council that we have employees go through their mid-management and training. We also have partnered with HBCUs. So in addition to employee, we want students and to work from an educational standpoint, where we have actually created a rotational management program from graduates of Morgan State University. So two graduates of Morgan State happen to win these rotational management programs. And it's not just working on the front lines, it's learning the integral part of management, from accounting to financing to operations. So these are some of the things that Choice is doing. And the fact that Choice has a dedicated person and a team to go after these under-opportunized minorities, I think bodes well, not just for the organization, but for the hospitality industry and the franchising industry as a whole. I am also part of the Black Franchise Leadership Council, and work with Ursa Jackson, as Michael knows, who is the chairman there, to promote all franchising. And I think Choice, being a franchisor itself, has a responsibility to make sure that we follow in inculcating that culture of inclusivity, diversity, and belonging.
Well, Justin, if I could say a few more nice things about John, in addition to his key role in the Black Franchise Leadership Council, under John's leadership, Choice Hotels International was part of IFA's new partnership last month in the HBCU Partnership Challenge. We joined what are now 78 different corporate participants in the HBCU Partnership Challenge. A handful of other franchise companies are a part of this. And the idea here is to promote franchise curricula at HBCUs. We've talked about information. John, I think, mentioned information being such a challenge, but it's also a way to remedy the structural challenges here towards expanding business opportunities. So the idea here is to raise awareness about the opportunities in our business community at HBCUs, so that there's greater awareness of this wider path to achieving the American dream of business ownership. John does a great job at Choice. We're heartened that there are more people like John at franchise brands all the time, promoting these opportunities, and it's an exciting time, we think.
Thank you both for that, and it raises sort of another topic that I'd like to get into, and that in talking about the work that Choice is doing. And that's the topic of corporate citizenship, this concept of corporate citizenship and what role businesses ought to be playing in this, again, resurgent push for equality, racial equality. And Dr. Chatelain, this is I'm going to go back in history again, but you're a historian, and I think it's incredibly important to look back at history for context and for a path forward. But if you could talk about the sort of history of this common push or common resurgence in the discussion on what role should corporations be playing in this battle, and what lessons we might learn from the past as we again find ourselves confronted with this heightened discussion on what role should companies be playing.
So I think that historically in the United States, corporate social responsibility has moved from kind of benevolence and charity to the idea of philanthropy to what we call social responsibility. And I think that transition from, philanthropy, just donating money to something because it's the right thing, to what are the ways in which local communities are holding corporations accountable is that big transition. And I think a lot of it comes around the period of time we've been talking about after King's assassination, where the questions that communities were asking were part of a larger movement to hold government, to hold legacy institutions accountable for the impact they have, whether intentional or unintentional, but that there was impact. And so, for instance, McDonald's has had a long history of encouraging and guiding franchisees to, donate to your local Cub Scouts, make sure that there's free cones for Girl Scouts, these kind of small scale community relations activities. But what happens in the late 60s is that African-American organizations are saying, wait a second, we don't have a park in our community. Maybe you should pay for a park. We don't have scholarships to the local HBCU. Maybe you should be on the hook for that. I talk about how the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense says, you have all this food and we're trying to have free breakfast for kids. You need to contribute to that. And I think what these conversations highlight isn't just about the power of the corporations, but I think the deep lack on the community level where people are scrambling and saying, can someone please help us with this? And I think that this is where we really need to be vigilant about what does it mean if a community is looking consistently to business for these things, instead of saying, wait, why don't we have other structures that are taxpayer funded, that are communal structures that can actually serve these needs, and that the business can be in a different position. And this is where I go back to the specificity of Black-owned businesses. I was in a panel in Chicago before COVID, and there were small business owners who were Black, and they said, we can't fulfill all the community requests. We can't donate at the levels that we want to donate at because our business doesn't have that capacity. And instead of saying to the business owners, we'll make more money, my question is, where is the community infrastructure? And would it be a better use of everyone's time if corporations were advocating for more public resources for everyone to have? I mean, we are in a process right now that we know it's hard to hire people for a lot of service industry jobs. Some people say it's a labor shortage. Other people say it's a crisis of work. But regardless, this is an incredible inflection point to say, wait a second, what is missing structurally in our society that is making it difficult for people to work? And what if we used our influence and power to make sure those structures are strong and know that that will make our business strong? Because I think historically we say, well, the businesses have to do more and the businesses have to do these things, and say, well, why don't we as a society get together and create such a strong support and safety net that, John doesn't have to worry about the childcare needs of his workers because we have free childcare. So his workers can come in, they can stay focused because they know that their kids are safe and sound. And so I think that the big lesson in history is that we, on one hand, want corporations to be socially responsible, but sometimes I think that the demands need to be that we need to come together and say, well, why don't we build a solid enough society that the corporation can focus on what it does best, and that the society can focus on what it does best, and that's taking care of each other. So I think that we have not gotten to that part of the conversation, but I think that, the post-COVID economic climate may push us in different directions to look in different places for these types of solutions.
Thank you. And I think we're quickly running out of time here. I think this is a great discussion, but I want to make sure that we hit everything that we intended to today. And I think in many respects, we've gotten into what is really the last part of this discussion. And again, a part of the discussion that we'll spend the balance of this series unpacking, which is what are the primary obstacles to this endeavor of increasing diversity in franchising, and sort of how might we meet those obstacles? Again, I think in many respects, some of those issues have already been highlighted, but Michael or John, if you could kind of give high-level thoughts on obstacles and at least preliminary thoughts on what might be done to meet those.
Well, I can start, John, if you'd like. I mean,
Michael,
Justin
please.
mentioned information, but we really see two huge issues here. One is information, and we think our partnership with HBCUs is certainly one thing we can do to expand awareness about the opportunities in franchising, as well as sort of the structure of franchising and how to get into it. But the other is access to capital. And, I'll go back to our research. We asked over 3,500 franchisees, were you capital constrained when you started your first business? And 63% of owners of all backgrounds said yes. And then we asked, was being a franchisee, was that helpful towards securing access to capital? 20% of Black owners said yes, being a franchisee helped provide me with the financing, with the connections to capital that were helpful, because overall we found that 34% of franchise owners in this survey that contributed to our research, 34% of franchise owners said without franchising, they would not own a business today. In other words, the benefits, the resources within franchising, it's sort of cooking with a recipe franchising. The advantages of franchising really do provide a wider opportunity to people of all backgrounds to own a business. And our research released last month really confirmed that.
In addition to that, access to equity, in which you are speaking of, and access to capital, it's the access to debt as well. Many times going into a bank, and we've heard these stories before, I'll just give one sort of short story. I had a woman walking to a bank, and she was a very, very successful hotelier. She owned 6 hotels, and she wanted to get financing for a new project. That financing, they gave her a specific interest rate, and she said, wow, that seems high. She leaves, comes back with her husband, goes to the same bank, and that bank then says, oh, I didn't know your husband was involved. He's a successful hotelier. Now that interest rate is lower by 1.5%. Why is that? Why is that the case? So as Dr. Chatelain mentioned, it's not just incumbent upon franchisees. It is something that is societal, that we have to encompass not only the community, but the banking industry, the whole entire franchise industry, to make sure that we're able to come together. And what can franchisors do to help? And how do we communicate, and how do we advocate along with the community into getting more franchise-owned businesses? How many underserved African-American or underrepresented areas do we need specific stores or specific hotels or specific banks, and we don't have them there? How can we create sort of that synergistic relationship between all three to move forward?
And I do want to save some time for questions here. Michael, you mentioned an information gap, and both you, Michael, and you, John, as well, also touched on this issue of access to financing and capital and debt, John, as you pointed out, as being another obstacle. We will be devoting programs in this series to those topics, because they're incredibly important ones, and ones that deserve treatment on their own. And so with that, there is one question here about access to capital. And so maybe we can touch on it just very briefly. And that is one of the barriers that we see in welcoming under opportunized. Someone has already latched on to John's wording there. Under opportunized minorities into franchising is financial resources. Can you speak to this idea of how we can partner and work with financial institutions to rethink their qualifications for offering loans for future franchisees?
I'll just hop in on that one, Justin. I believe it's working with them and letting them know that many times that we may not have the experience to have a franchise or to own a franchise, but we do have a business acumen specifically from other types of work or other types of school that we have done, and it's closing that gap and it's getting that opportunity. It's partnering with somebody. It's having some of those corporations to have someone else partnering with them, mentoring them if they do not have that experience needed to get the debt, to get the equity or find the equity. We need to leverage those relationships, not only just within our organization, but outside of our organization. People that we know, organizations and corporations that we can partner with, move them forward with whether it's the U.S. Black Chamber of Commerce, U.S. Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, and some of the things that they're doing, moving with the Black Franchise Leadership Council and pairing them with them. And again, we talk about this fiscal capital is what we need as well, but it's informational capital that goes a lot further.
Yeah, and Justin, I'll just add that, when you're in franchising, you have a franchisor partner, whether it's Choice Hotels, franchises, franchise brands deliver substantial assistance to business owners. You're in business for yourself, but not by yourself is one of our phrases. And there's genuine truth there. Franchisors help connect you with lenders and provide paths to access to capital and debt and training and managerial assistance, and supply chain savings, which is so critical right now. So there's so many resources within the franchise model. You don't have to go to Wharton Business School or Harvard to become a Silicon Valley entrepreneur in this environment. You can own a franchise, and the path to getting to business ownership is wider in our community.
I want to hit one final question before we get to a couple of minutes of closing remarks. And that question is, do you think that having more African Americans or people of color in franchise development within franchisors might assist or aid in increasing diversity among franchisees?
I'll say this, to the extent that these people who are developing potential business owners have the power and have the voice and the position to actually course correct the problems that unusually burden franchisees of color. So again, back to this issue of diversity inclusion is only effective if people put in these roles have power to do things, whether it's to recommend, rent abatement, to make sure that, discriminatory lending practices are not tolerated in formal partnerships, if it's to reevaluate, the disparities in locations, right? So like all of these things would be helpful if these positions are put in a place where there's actually power and authority to do them, because we are constantly relearning the limitations of diversity inclusion strategies that are not tied to power and actually ability to change policy and implement the kinds of things that people need to thrive.
Thank you for that. And I think with that, we'll close the discussion. There are some additional questions. We'll do our best to get a response to those questions out. I think a lot of them sort of issues that are going to be addressed in future program series. So as you see materials for future programs, I think you'll see that some of these questions, if you've posed a question that hasn't been responded to, that topic is going to be a topic of focus in future sessions. And so with that, I just want to thank our panelists for participating in this discussion. I think it's been a great one. And so thank you for participating. Importantly, thank you for the work that you're doing, because it's incredible. And then I also want to thank the audience again. I said thank you in the opening remarks, but audience involvement and participation is particularly important in this endeavor. In terms of future programming, we do have a program scheduled for December 7th, still of this year, and the title of that program is Increasing Diversity in Franchise Systems, and that will hit on recruiting diverse franchisees, creating a diverse franchisor organization, to actually go to the question that was posed earlier about the benefits of diversity within franchisors. And then also considerations for emerging franchisors and mature systems. And then as we turn the calendar to 2002, we'll pivot the focus of this program a little bit to prospective franchisees and franchisors. And the anticipated program will include topics such as franchising, what it means for business owners and brand owners, from a sort of the process of business and legal considerations for franchisees, doing diligence, researching potential franchise opportunities, and then executing on those opportunities and what's involved in that process. And then finally, navigating access to capital challenges, which is something that we've touched on briefly here today, and we'll spend an entire program on. Following this program, you'll get a survey. That survey will ask for feedback on this program. It'll also ask for ideas for future programming, because we do not, none of us believe or under the illusion that we've got this to these issues on our own. So we'll be soliciting ideas for future programming, as well as ways that we might reach a broader audience. So look out for that survey in the days to come, as well as information on how you might access a recording of this event. And with that, I will bid you adieu and thank you again for attending. And thanks again to our panel.